This is the Resistance Report for October 2nd, 2017. Tonight, I want to share with you some candid thoughts about guns and the public's health and safety. Now, what I have to say should not alarm any gun enthusiast, but it should spur us to action. I can guarantee you that if the person who murdered 59 or more people and wounded 500 or more in Las Vegas last night was someone with an Arab-sounding name, or a Muslim, or somebody from a Muslim country, you can bet that the Trump administration and the Republican Congress would be up in arms, literally and figuratively. A flurry of laws, a flurry of restrictions. But if the murderer is another crazed American, armed to the teeth, then we're told that nothing can be done. Last year, after a 29-year-old security guard walked into a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, and fired off 102 rounds from his semi-automatic rifle and pistol, killing 49 people in what was then considered the worst mass shooting in modern American history, Congress rejected various bipartisan gun control bills, including restricting sales to people on the federal terrorism watch list. Every 2 months, we lose more Americans to gun violence than we did in the 9/11 attacks, according to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We lose some 2,800 children and teenagers to guns every year. That's more than the number of American troops who've died in any year in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. More than twice as many preschoolers die annually from gun violence in America as law enforcement officers are killed in the line of duty. After last night's shooting in Las Vegas, you've got to ask, is there any possible way our leaders could at least seriously consider the wisdom of this nation's bizarrely lax approach to weapons of mass destruction? We're not heading in the right direction. Since 1982, there have been 92 mass shootings in the United States. A 2014 FBI study found that so-called active shootings have become more than twice as common just since the year 2000. The worst are remembered simply by where they occurred: Columbine High School, Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook Elementary, Fort Hood, Orlando, and now Las Vegas. None of these has produced any serious reform. If anything, the issue of gun control has become even more politically polarized, and predictably, the National Rifle Association and its supporters in Congress say, this is not the moment to discuss gun control right now. We shouldn't politicize, they say, what occurred last night. We should leave time to mourn the victims and give condolences to their families. They say, let's not get into another polarized debate right now. It's exactly what they said and what we heard after Orlando and Columbine and after my good friend, Representative Gabby Giffords, was shot in the head by a young man later diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. But, my friends, let me ask you this. If we don't renew the debate now, when will we? The typical response of the NRA after a tragedy like last night's is not to say a word, to wait until the outrage and the stories of mayhem and the suffering have just gone away. And then they stop in their tracks any talk of the public safety crisis we are dealing with in this country by allowing almost anyone to have almost any instrument of mass destruction. When the issue is framed as gun control, surveys show that the American public is split. But when it's seen as a crisis of public health and safety, and when particular ideas are put forward, such as background checks on private sales, restricting sales to the mentally ill, banning assault weapons, and so on, the majority of Americans are consistently in favor. It just makes no logical sense to denounce what happened in Las Vegas last night while ignoring the proliferation of powerful weapons in this country. I'm sorry, but I think we need more than soothing words at this point. We have got to demand that President Trump and Republican leaders of Congress finally take real steps to reduce the likelihood of mass murder in America. Now, absurdly, the Trump administration has already taken steps to make it easier for both fugitives and the mentally ill to buy guns. Meanwhile, the House of Representatives could pass legislation as early as this week that would roll back decades-old restrictions on gun silencers, opening the market for a device that critics say would make it more difficult in a mass shooting to discover where gunfire is actually coming from. Supporters call them noise suppressors. The legislation is a top priority for the National Rifle Association, although a number of city police chiefs have already signed a letter of opposition. Gun sales have slumped since Trump's election, and leading gun makers are looking for a new source of revenue, and they have found one in silencers, they think. But many police chiefs say the only legitimate use for silencers is for military tactical teams who use silencers to confuse the sound of gunfire and confound an enemy's response to surprise attacks. In a letter to Congress, the police chiefs write that the widespread and uncontrolled distribution of silencers to an unwary civilian population, combined with the sheer number of firearms already freely available in America, is a step in the wrong direction and will result in tragedy, including violence directed at police officers that will be difficult or impossible to investigate effectively. That is what they said. Silencers, like machine guns, have been strictly regulated since 1934 in the United States under the National Firearms Act. In response to mob killings then, current law requires buyers to submit fingerprints and a photograph, pay a special tax, submit to a background check, and notify local law enforcement. Peter Ambler, Executive Director of Americans for Responsible Solutions, that's a gun violence prevention organization founded by former Representative Gabby Giffords, says no one who is willing to go through the process has a problem obtaining a gun silencer if they're willing to go through the process. And because of the regulation now in place, we've had remarkably few crimes committed with silencers, or, for that matter, with machine guns, compared to handguns and semi-automatics. Congress is also planning to consider a second major piece of weapons legislation this fall that would allow people to carry concealed weapons in any state if it is allowed in the state where they live. If you're in one of the dozen states that have no permit requirement for carrying a concealed weapon, you could, under this bill, take your concealed weapon into a state like California or New York, states that require applications for such a permit for a concealed weapon to demonstrate a need and submit to a background check. Oh, there's another provision now in Congress that would allow the use of armor-piercing bullets. Republicans say these bills are for hunters, but I want to ask you, do hunters really need silencers? Do they really need armor-piercing bullets? Do they really need to conceal their guns in order to hunt? There's a reasonable argument that the Second Amendment confers an individual right to bear a musket or a gun. On the other hand, almost everyone agrees on the ban on fully automatic machine guns, weapons that reload automatically and fire continuously with one trigger pull. They've been banned for civilians in the United States since the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986. That ban has worked. The use of fully automatic machine guns in crimes is rare. Of the 92 American mass shootings that have occurred since 1982, not one has involved a fully automatic machine gun. The weapon that's caused the most mayhem has been the semi-automatic rifle. In other words, the question is not, and has never been, whether to limit the right to bear arms. It's where to draw the line. The United States is not going to ban guns, but we can take reasonable steps to reduce the carnage. What should we do? For starters, number one, we limit gun purchases to one a month. That's in order to curb gun traffickers. Number two, we restrict the sale of high-capacity magazines so a shooter can't kill as many people without reloading. Number three, we impose a universal background check for gun buyers, even with private sales. Number four, we make serial numbers on guns more difficult to erase. Number five, we require micro-stamping so that bullet casings can be traced back to a particular gun. Number six, we finance gun buybacks. Number seven, we require that guns be stored in gun safes or with trigger locks. Number eight, we restrict sales to the mentally ill. Number nine, ban assault-style weapons or large-capacity magazine clips. Number 10, we say no to gun silencers. Number 11, we say no to the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act that is now in Congress. These are just common sense. We are not helpless. And by the way, if you need to enter a code to operate your cell phone, why should you not have to enter a code to fire your gun? For everybody out there who says we should not regulate guns or that guns don't kill people, people kill people, you hear this all the time, let me remind you, we have regulations that make automobiles safer. As with guns, some auto deaths are caused by people who break laws or behave irresponsibly, but we don't just throw up our hands and say, cars don't kill people, drunks do. No, we require that cars be safer, that they won't easily roll over in a crash, that glass won't shatter. We require seatbelts, airbags, child seats. We have laws that limit licenses for young drivers. All this has had an effect. It has reduced America's traffic fatality rate per mile driven by nearly 90% since the 1950s. Or another example. When I was Labor Secretary, I oversaw the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Now, OSHA is there to make sure that workers are safe on the job. OSHA has pages of regulations about all sorts of things that workers use. Ladders, for example. Ladders, step ladders. They kill around 300 Americans a year. There are regulations for ladders. Guns kill 30,000 people a year. Other federal laws protect the safety of consumers. We even regulate toy guns by requiring orange tips. So why do we not regulate real guns as carefully as we do toy guns? It's more difficult to adopt a pet than it is to buy a gun. Other countries have made themselves safer. One example, in 1996, I remember in Australia, a mass killing of 35 people pushed the nation's conservative prime minister to ban certain rapid-fire guns. The National Firearms Agreement, as it was known then, led to the buyback of 650,000 guns in Australia and to tighter rules for licensing and safe storage of those remaining in the public's hands. In the 18 years before Australia's law, Australia suffered 13 mass shootings, but it didn't have a single mass shooting in the 14 years after the law took full effect. The murder rate with firearms in Australia has dropped by more than 40%, according to data compiled by the Harvard Injury Control Research Center. And the suicide rate with firearms in Australia has dropped by more than half. Australia's law did not end gun ownership in Australia. It reduced the number of firearms in private hands by 1/5, and they were the kinds most likely to be used in mass shootings. Or you can look at Canada, which now requires a 28-day waiting period to buy a handgun. It imposes another safeguard. Not a bad idea. Gun buyers must have the support of 2 people vouching for them. Now, you know as well as I do, gun laws don't always prevent massacres. I mean, there was a knife attack in China. There was a terrible massacre of children in Norway a couple of years ago. But in a typical year, Norway, for example, has 10 or fewer gun murders. And that attack in China, not one of those children died. Some people say the best way to protect yourself against getting killed by somebody breaking into your home is by having a handgun in the house. That is just not true. Research over and over again makes it clear that having a gun in the home makes it more likely that you will be shot by your partner or by even yourself. Americans are safer if they rely on 911 for protection rather than on a gun. Look, we're not going to eliminate gun deaths any more than we have eliminated auto accidents. But if we could reduce gun deaths only by 1/3 in the United States, that would be 10,000 lives saved every year. That's a lot of people. Why are we so afraid of the National Rifle Association? Why are our politicians so utterly lacking in backbone? If we want to save lives, we can. Without encroaching on the Second Amendment, without making it harder for hunters to use guns reasonably, why don't we? Why don't we? Let's use the tragedy of last night to rekindle the national debate we must have and come up with reasonable solutions. That is all for tonight.